My name is Erin Gregory, and I'm the Assistant Curator at the Canada Aviation and Space Museum. I think the Arrow has kind of the legendary status that it does because the program was cut so abruptly. There was so much publicity at the time around the airplane that everyone was very familiar with it. Avro was at the cutting edge of aviation technology in Canada at the time. So when the program was canceled so abruptly and there was a massive loss of jobs, up to about 14,000, 15,000 at Avro, but then also had a cascading effect throughout the aviation industry in Canada. And I think that shock and the publicity around that shock kind of cements the legend of the Arrow in Canadians' minds. The program has its genesis in the Cold War. So Canada being physically in between Russia, well, the USSR at the time, and the United States, there was this thought that the Russians were going to send nuclear-armed bombers over the North Pole, over Canada, and then drop these nuclear weapons on the United States. So there was need for defense in the North, and since Canada was the best place to do that, we started developing fighter jets and interceptors to help the Americans with their early lines of defense. So we started off with the CF-100, but very early on, even when the CF-100 was just in its testing phase, they realized it was not going to have the range that was required to actually meet the bombers where it was useful up in the north. So there was kind of further concepts built up by the RCAF, the Royal Canadian Air Force, talking about what actual specifications of aircraft would work best for them. In its day, I think at the time, it was really the notion of supersonic speeds. So that necessitated a very specific form of airframe. So the delta wing in particular was going to be the ultimate configuration to operate at supersonic speeds. The Arrow also needed to have twin engines to get it up to that speed and also to give it the range that it needed. There was an early fly-by-wire system. So that meant that the controls for the airplane changed from mechanical controls to electrical controls, and that would help the pilot manage such a large airplane at super high speeds. The project was ongoing from the early 50s to February 20th, 1959, when what we call Black Friday occurred, and that was the ultimate shutdown of the program. For a couple of months after that, the aircraft were physically dismantled and cut up, so you could probably run that into about mid-59. But in general, there were 6 airframes built at that time, 5 Mark I's and then 1 Mark II, which was meant to be kind of the test bed for the Iroquois engine, which was being developed in concert with the airframe. It's impossible to tell if it would have been everything it was set out to do. It's quite, it's very possible. Certainly it did very well in its testing, but it never really got the chance to fail. Also, with the production of aircraft, generally there's a long development period even after its initial testing. So when it goes into production, very often there's modifications that need to be made that become apparent as more and more aircraft are produced and used. So it's impossible to tell what the Arrow would have done if production had continued into the 60s. Certainly it wouldn't have been ready for service until 1961. And by then there was this idea that fighter interceptors would be obsolete. So the idea of continuing to invest and pour money into this project seemed to be kind of a little foolhardy. Yes, there were several test flights. So the rollout of RL-201, which was the first Arrow produced, was on October 4th, 1957. Incidentally, the same day that the Russians launched their first satellite, Sputnik, and that kind of helped to cement the fate of the Arrow. The first test flight was on March 25th, 1958, and Jan Zurokowski was the test pilot for that flight. It lasted about 35 minutes, and it all went swimmingly, and he was cheered very loudly when he came down. But he said himself that the flight was actually probably more exciting for the people on the ground watching the Arrow take off than it was for him trying to remember all these hundreds of do's and don'ts and maintaining the checklist as he was flying the airplane. So the project was scrapped for a variety of reasons. One of the main reasons was that this idea during the Cold War that, especially after the launch of Sputnik, that the nature of warfare was going to change. So no longer would you have the Russians flying over Canada with nuclear-armed bombers, but you would be using intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so the idea was that you would need to produce intercontinental ballistic missiles to counter those attacks. The Arrow also had kind of extreme cost overruns because the airframe was being developed simultaneously with the engine, simultaneously with a new fire suppression system, simultaneously with a new weapon system, and this was extreme. So it could have been cost effective when all the RCAF squadrons were going to be outfitted with this airplane. But then it was decided that it was a bit too much airplane for the auxiliary squadrons and they wouldn't be able to fly it, and so it was down to just the permanent squadrons. And then at that point, you're not ordering enough airplanes to actually make that project cost effective anymore. This is actually standard military practice. So the aircraft were destroyed because that's just sort of the way it goes. You're trying to protect the technology that you have developed, first of all. They certainly didn't want it to fall into the hands of any of their Cold War enemies. So it's pretty much standard practice just to destroy any sensitive material. Yeah, so there are no complete Avro Arrows that survived this dismantling at the end of the program, but some pieces did manage to survive. Certainly there are blueprints and photographs and drawings and some documents from the company that survived as well. Some things were kept in private hands by employees who either stuffed them in their jackets as they were leaving. Some of these parts were sort of disposed of in various ways, either used for testing, such as at the National Research Council, for example. And there were some employees who had actually taken work home and were not present at the office on Black Friday, so they managed to keep all of their material as well. So in our collection, we have the nose from RL-206, which was the Mark II intended for the Iroquois engine. It was saved because it had gone to the NRC for high altitude testing. And after it served its purpose at the NRC in the early 60s, there was one of their employees who had been involved in the testing kind of recognized that this could be a really important historical object, and so kept it for a while, or so the story goes, until the political fallout around the Arrow died down, and then donated it to the National Aviation Museum at the time. So we have the nose of RL-206. We have the wingtips from 203. We have a number of blueprints. We have a lot of photographs. We have the entire Fred Smyth collection, and he was one of the high-ranking executives at Avro at the time. We also have a lot of video footage from Avro as well, and interviews with people who had worked there. So our collection is actually quite extensive. We're very lucky. After the project was scrapped, this is, I think, another part of the public bone of contention with the death of Avro, and which coincided with the killing of the Arrow project, which was that a lot of its brightest minds went elsewhere. So they took their expertise to NASA and worked on the moon landing program. A lot of them went over to British Aerospace and lent their expertise in the development of the Concorde, which is another supersonic airplane intended for commercial flight. So there's this idea that what could have been had Avro stayed in the aviation game in Canada, had they continued to be at the forefront of aviation technology and development, that it may have been a game changer, I guess, is the idea. And that's sort of what sticks around in the minds of Canadians the most, I think. The Delta test vehicle is one of the, it's basically an object that was recovered from the bed of Lake Ontario. And this was part of a project led by the OAX Recovery Group, which is sort of a private group of individuals who embarked on this mission to find the free flight models of the Avro Arrow. The free flight models, there are 11 of them produced, and they were part of the production method of the Avro Arrow, which in order to expedite the Arrow's entry into service, they skipped the prototyping phase. This is called the Cook-Craigie method, and so you kind of leapfrog over this idea of building just one prototype, testing it, making all kinds of adjustments, having to retool your factory every time you make a large modification, and they relied pretty extensively on wind tunnel testing and then these free flight models. Next summer will be the third and final attempt to find the free flight models, so we're very hopeful that at least one or two will be recovered, and we'll see how things go from there. Other than that, it's really about the pieces that are held in private hands, and we'll see kind of what comes of that, as well as people are hearing more about the project. They may be willing to part with objects that they have in their possession. So we'll have to see. It's impossible to say what exactly is out there, but we're certainly hopeful about the free flight models.